Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Good morning, honourable youth members. It's a pleasure to have you here today at Queensland Parliament House. I want to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the land of Aboriginal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I thank them as First Australians for their careful custodianship of the land over countless generations. In this country of ours, we are very fortunate to have two of the world's oldest continuing living cultures in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose lands, winds and waters we all now share. It is wonderful to have you here at the Parliament today. I understand, of course, the subject that you do. Once, believe it or not, I was a high school student as well. I did legal studies, and yes, I got the award for it 2 years in a row. It was an amazing subject because it teaches you a lot about so many aspects of our community, as well as the way that it's governed. And that's really, really important because the laws that are made in the seats that you're sitting in right now are very, very important. And that's why we don't take it lightly. When we make decisions here, we don't vote on it once, we vote on it twice, and then we vote on it again to make sure that we're not making any errors. It's very important that those decisions are binding, and they're very, very important. Parliament itself, though, of course, you will see lots about what happens. Mostly, you'll hear about the government. And the government is very important because they have the majority in this House. But at the end of the day, the Parliament is more than the government. The Parliament is the government, it is the executive, it is the opposition, it's the crossbenchers and independents. So everyone in this House has a say. I'm a member of the Parliament and we have 93 members, but I'm one of 93. So the other members of this House, no matter what position they hold, all have a very important voice. And so it's very important that you understand that those MPs, no matter where they are, represent somewhere geographically in Queensland, and they have a say and a voice for that particular region. When you think about the laws that you'll be debating today in a mock form, it's very important that we look at the way that we make long-lasting change. Yesterday I was in the Red Chamber, which is our Legislative Council, which is no longer in use, but we had the Brisbane Dialogues, which was a culmination of works that students had done in the local area. The topic that they debated was, is TikTok any good? And you might say, well, yeah, we all have a view about that, and sometimes it's great. But ultimately it was about the understanding of how our world works and the fact that this place, the seats you're sitting in now, has to keep up with a range of things, including changing technology. And are we doing that? Are we able to do it in a way that regulates it? And are we able to do it in a way that it actually shapes the community that we live in? So it's very, very important. The bill that you're debating today, of course, includes a number of different challenges. And again, it's about making sure that you understand that what you're doing is actually about the community you live in. So one of the challenges of being a Member of Parliament is that you're not an individual. Sometimes you have an individual vote, but mostly you are there representing your community. So you have to make decisions that are based on what you think is the best or what is in the best interest of your community. So when you're debating this today, think about it in those terms. Think about the idea that you're representing a broader community and you're also collectively representing the entire state of Queensland. And if you can do it in those terms, then you'll be doing yourselves a great justice. You'll be doing yourselves a justice that you won't be politicians, you'll be parliamentarians. And that's actually a very important distinction. So we have a great number of students here today. It's terrific to see the chamber absolutely full. We have 42 schools participating today. We have AB Patterson College, Aquinas College, Australian Christian College Moreton, Australian Christian College Moreton Distance Education, Brigadine College, Centenary Heights State School, City Point Christian College, St Patrick's College Shorncliffe, Coomera Anglican College, Earnshaw State College, Fairholme College, Fraser Coast Anglican College, Genesis Christian College, Good Shepherd Lutheran College, Grace Lutheran College, Groves Christian College, Harvey Bay State High School, Kedron State High School, Kenmore State High, Kepnock State High, Marsden State High, Moreton Bay College, Mountain Creek State High, Mount Alvarina College, Ormo Woods State High, and Pacific Lutheran College. These schools are making up the government to my right. We also welcome the schools making up Her Majesty's loyal opposition. Powder College, Prince of Peace Lutheran College, Redlands State College, Redeemer Lutheran College, Robina State High, Somerville House, Springwood State High, Pacific Lutheran College, St James College, St Joseph's Gregory Terrace, which I believe is bringing the Leader of the Opposition, St Lawrence's College, Loretto College, the Gap State High, and thank you very much to my Sergeant-at-Arms, the Glennie School, the Lakes College, Wavell State High, Mountain Creek State High, Moreton Bay College, and Yeronga State High. So students, you've already had the run through, I'm sure, but remembering that there is a really important thing you can do here today, and that is speak loud, speak clearly, be articulate, and importantly, if someone is doing a great job, give them a big hear here. And it's a great thing to do because it's really important to encourage your colleagues, and whether that's in the real parliament or today, it's important to do that because when people are making a good point, we're all about democracy and it's a great thing for you to do. So with that being said, I now declare this Youth Parliament open. I call the Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Members of Parliament, people of Queensland, Queensland's future is bright. Queensland continues to be the state of opportunity, opportunity to grow and to shine, an opportunity to show the world what we are made of. Queenslanders are determined and resilient. Queenslanders unite to make our state shine bright. No matter the problem, we will continue to bounce back. Nothing continues to prove this better than the community response to the February flooding. Whole communities working together in a clean-up effort, supporting each other through this tough time. Our response to the pandemic, people working together, even during isolation, to ensure we remain safe and healthy, determined, resilient and united. Our future is bright and we continue to be the state that will lead the way. The 2032 Olympics will ensure we are recognised on the global stage as a place of prospect. We will demonstrate to the world that Queensland is the future of Australia. Our continued reconciliation work in moving forward by recognising our First Nation Australians as a core group in our society. Projects such as the Queensland Government Deadly Innovation will ensure we foster and maintain respectful relations, helping us move forward together as a state, empowering our Indigenous communities. Our state is in a position to increase employment across Queensland and lead the way in technology and multiple Queensland innovations. Some examples of this are the Female Funders Program and the Ecosystem Support Strategy, both of which will nurture a sustainable future for all Queenslanders. Thank you, Queenslanders. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Youth Premier. I call the Youth Leader of the Opposition.
Good morning, Mr Speaker and members of the House. Think 10, 30, even 50 years from now, what Queensland could and should be. Our place in the world is here for the taking. The 2032 Olympic winning bid will see our state on the world stage. This kickstarts my vision for a cleaner, brighter and more sustainable Queensland. It starts today. Each and every one of us in this Parliamentary Assembly has a role to play. What decisions we make today will leave a legacy for future generations. I want the members of the 2022 Parliament to look back at us sitting here today and say, we put Queensland first. We will do this from the outback to the coastal regions. The towns, cities and shires, we are one state with one goal, Queensland first. Resources are no longer infinite, and resources in Queensland are precious and need protecting. We begin with the most valuable of our resources, the people of Queensland who make up this great state. First and foremost is the contribution of our First Nations people. We look to them to inspire us and guide us. We then look to the resources which are our lands, our rivers and pastures, to nurture them for a brighter, more sustainable future. As the opposition, we will be leaders who inspire all people from all walks of life to work with us to make Queensland great. Members, what we do right now in our roles as elected representatives must leave a legacy for this great state that is cleaner, brighter and more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Youth Leader of the Opposition. Now move to the introduction of the and second reading debate of the bill. I call the Youth Minister for the Information Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave of the House to move a motion without notice.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
Leave is granted.
Mr.
I call the Minister.
Sorry. Mr. Speaker, I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended and as would otherwise prevent the immediate presentation to the House of the bill for a Youth Act to enable the creation, collection and deployment of big data in Queensland and the passing of such bill through all its stages in one day.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those against no? No. I think the ayes have it. I call the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I present the bill and explanatory notes and move that the bill be now read a first time.
The question is that the bill be now read a first time. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Bureaucratic Information Gathering, Data Access, Technology and Application Bill 2022.
I call the Youth Minister for the Information Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a second time. I call the Youth Shadow Minister for the Information.
No, that's my job. Your job's to give your explanatory speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today it was a great honour that I introduced the Bureaucratic Information Gathering, Data Access, Technology and Application Bill of 2022. This bill holds an objective of harnessing the power of big data to maximise the efficiency and effectiveness of government services, establish data management in Queensland, allow for the collection of DNA, introduce drone and satellite surveillance, and harvest and monitor health and education data. The Big Data proposal has the intention of prompting optimal civil, social, environmental and health outcomes for all Queenslanders. The civil and social welfare outlined in Clause 6 is an essential aspect of further improving the safety of the Queensland community. Furthermore, both health and education data would have endless advantages, which would have perhaps improved our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Department of Dread holds the responsibility of collecting and monitoring education and health data produced by other government services and departments and will provide a data bank for the storage and identification of DNA. The civic and social surveillance aspects identified will prove to have long-lasting environmental effects and assistances through statewide satellite and drone surveillance. It is important to consider that the Big Data Bill will pose as an invitation to an improved and safer society where such data is managed successfully. The primary objective of the bill is to optimise the efficiency and effectiveness of government decision-making in the key areas of community welfare and safety, health and education, and environmental management. The COVID-19 pandemic has shone a light on the limitations of traditional emergency management processes, along with the struggle to manage immediate health crises and public health and economic consequences. The pandemic has highlighted the immediate power of big data and ultimately suggested that it will improve government response. I urge you to consider the numerous undeniably clear advantages of the Big Data Bill of 2022. I commend the bill to the House.
I now call the Youth Minister for Information Economy.
Mr. Speaker, this bill must be opposed. Any thinking person that appreciates the value of our democracy cannot support such drastic proposals for dealing with citizens' data. This bill is an outrageous grab at bureaucratic and government power. Under the cover of public safety and health, as well as improved environmental outcomes, the government will effectively create a police state regulated by a dreadful government department. There are many problems with this bill. The first concern, Mr. Speaker, is the obvious breach in human rights such as privacy. It is going to invade people's privacy through access to their DNA, monitoring of their social media, watching their private activities with drone technology. And if the minister opposite really thinks this bill is compatible with with our state's Human Rights Act, I'd suggest they have a second look. That Act specifies a human right may be subject under law only to reasonable limits that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. In no ways can the proposals in this bill be considered reasonable nor demonstrably justified. Secondly, there is an alarming lack of protection against big government. There isn't a clear provision in the bill for checks and balances to keep the government to account. Such laws would allow governments to find ways to abuse the power given to them. Mr. Speaker, the so-called extensive consultation that apparently occurred does not seem to have included the most important stakeholders, Queensland citizens, and the civil liberty groups that support their rights. Yeah. We have heard the minister say these reforms could help with the greater cause in terms of health, security, and the environment. However, the enormous human rights sacrifice these reforms propose are unacceptable. These proposed laws should bring dread to every Queenslander. They are too far-reaching and dangerous, and surely will be used for the wrong purpose to the detriment of the average Queenslander. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Thank you, Shadow Minister. I call the youth member for Boyne.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House of the environmental benefits through statewide satellite and drone surveillance under the Big Data Bill. The data collected by drone surveillance is particularly important in providing evidence-based information to future governments in order to make decisions relating to areas vulnerable to pollution, the spread of weeds, vegetation clearing, and stock movements in high-density traffic areas. By flying safely and at relatively high speeds, drones can cover large and small properties to quickly manage assets, resources, and land. The data generated through satellite imagery will be sent to DREAD for storage and analysis and will continue to revolutionise the efficiency process, allowing farmers to maximise their yield and limit their expendable resources in greater scale each year. The growth of the drone sector is expected to deliver significant cost savings to agricultural industries of $2.95 billion over the next 20 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, youth member. I call the youth member for McIntyre.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to voice my concerns with Clause 4C of the Big Data Bill. This clause, in summary, permits the use of drones as a surveillance tool. While the use of drones has undoubtedly proven of some benefit to the community in several factors, such as agriculture, a use that is envisioned by Clause 8 of the bill, this clause, as supported by the part heading Social and Civic Surveillance in its current form, is quite concerning in its potential to authorise grave breaches of privacy and intrusion into people's lives. The potential for 1984-style Orwellian government overreach is clear. In short, the clause would allow the governments to invade aspects of people's lives. Drone surveillance, for instance, could be used to wrongfully target minority groups and invade privacy. For example, a rally by workers' unions who often speak out against government policies could be subject to this surveillance. Furthermore, this bill would allow for peaceful demonstrators exercising their civil liberty to protest, a right long cherished in this great liberal democratic state of ours, to be identified by drone technology and targeted based on their political beliefs. This grave violation clearly does not meet the egalitarian beliefs of our society. Freedom of speech is a fundamental democratic right, and the potential use of drones to intimidate and identify individuals that might challenge government policy undermines this principle. This bill, and particularly Clause 4C relating to drone technology, purports to improve public security, but it is my view that this should not come at the cost of the potential violation of fundamental individual liberties. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Bloomfield.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to express my electorate support for the proposed 2022 Big Data Bill. I believe the objectives and aims outlined in the Act will maximise the efficiency and effectiveness of government systems and services by harnessing the power of big data in Queensland. The introduction of DREAD will be integral in alleviating the issues of decentralisation and fragmentation of resources within the state and federal government. The Act clearly outlines the benefits of DNA collection, with its application enhancing public safety and informing government decisions in various sectors. The ethical concerns raised regarding the potential breach of property and privacy rights by the bill are reasonable, as the Human Rights Act states that a person's right to property and privacy should not be unlawfully or arbitrarily interfered with. However, I agree with the Youth Minister for Information Economy that the bill does not infringe on these rights, as it limits human rights only to the extent that is just and reasonable, and in accordance with the best interests of my state and my electorate of Bloomfield. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Nagoa.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I may not speak for the rest of the House. However, I myself do not wish to be under constant surveillance by my government. The members opposite of me might claim that this is the collection of big data for Queensland's security and protection. However, how can this be when our personal data is being collated and stored far from our control? The way in which the government will profile individuals may not be in violation of our human rights, but a clear violation of our dignity and common human decency, which we as Australians should all understand. The current bill will certainly not bode well for Australians. They have never trusted the government, that much is evident. How could they possibly trust us now? Furthermore, if we start down this track, we will be no better than the social media sites who collect personal information with the intent to manipulate and deceive us for profit and outcome. Australia will descend into tyranny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Colgoa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are a myriad of benefits connected to the Big Data Bill. Today I rise to speak on the collection of data samples. Allowing for the collection of data samples will provide another layer of forensic evidence at a crime scene with little to no witnesses. These new DNA processes will permit law enforcement agents to match the DNA sample with records to accurately establish any matches. If a match does transpire, the forensic evidence may assist in locating the correct suspect who otherwise would not have been found. Having the collection of DNA samples may also lower the overall rate of crime, as it will act as a deterrent for the public. Furthermore, the DNA sample collection can be used in genetic studies and to help link genetic relations. Possessing considerable knowledge about DNA will create multiple opportunities to understand why gene mutations occur and to advance treatments for genetic diseases. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Pimpamar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is the concern of the opposition that whilst we can see the merit in the increase of educational and medical data collection for the purposes of well-being, I must address other issues within this bill. It goes far beyond what is morally acceptable in regards to the increase of surveillance in Queensland. There is sufficient surveillance statewide for the goals of the Queensland Police and traffic infrastructure, both of which are key aspects of the bill. An extreme increase in data collection via surveillance could be a conduit to many human rights issues that currently exist in other countries. Such oppressive levels of surveillance are for the gain of the government rather than the people. These invasions of privacy are unacceptable in Queensland society. Furthermore, the statement of compatibility agreed with by our Parliament states that all laws must fundamentally agree with all human rights. This is enforced by the Human Rights Act, Section 38(1), stating a member who proposes a bill must prepare a statement of compatibility. Thus, Mr. Speaker, if this bill were to be introduced, even a minor breach of our human rights for the greater good could be a route to the eventual oppression of Queenslanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Russell.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to discuss the Big Data Bill 2022. The purpose of this bill is to enable the creation, collection and deployment of big data in Queensland. Specifically, I draw your attention to Part 5, Clause 8, which introduces the use of satellite and drones. The most obvious benefit will be the amelioration of the government's ability to make advantageous decisions in relation to vegetation clearing, the spread of weeds, the spread of pollution and the population of endangered species in vulnerable environments. It is possible that this technique will even increase the population numbers of animals and plants within endangered groups. Surveillance could be used to count and map traffic movement across the state by providing information on high-density traffic areas and the transport of stock and goods, in turn making our roads safer and more efficient. In the long run, it could assist the government to target its infrastructure spending to the areas of greatest need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Staten.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to draw the attention of the House to a complication under Clause 6E, which states that DNA evidence may be compulsorily collected, stored and identified without the mention of an order from a magistrate. Compulsory testing removes the citizen's ability to consent and contradicts Clause 6A, which states that DNA will be collected on a voluntary basis. Additionally, the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act states that a magistrate can only order a forensic procedure if the results may provide evidence of an indictable offence the person being tested is suspected of committing. This bill violates the law by removing that necessity and allowing the collection of individuals' DNA without reason. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Horton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Queensland continues to grow and advance, the introduction of big data collection and utilisation can be observed in a multitude of fields, including perhaps the most relevant in recent years, public health. The recent events regarding the COVID-19 pandemic have not only identified big data as a crucial element in the prevention of future incidents, but also highlighted a plethora of ways in which our government can refine its big data management. During the last few years, big data has largely influenced government disease containment decisions, which ultimately led Queensland to its rapid COVID recovery with a mere quarter of New South Wales mortality cases. These successes prove that proactive advancements in big data management will allow us to preserve the safety and prosperity of Queensland and its citizens. The bill in question today promises to ensure a future where, if another crisis were to befall Queensland, our government holds the ability to make better, more informed decisions to protect our citizens and ultimately to save lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to advise the House of some transgressions within the proposed bill. Privacy and personal security are global issues. My question to you all is this: why would any reasonable person willingly wish to have their privacy invaded? It's allowing for comprehensive and arguably total surveillance of any individual. It is even with limitations pertaining to health and education, it does not excuse the major invasion of privacy. Where is the informed consent? For every eye laid on the data, for every experiment and test occurring, for every minor detail involved in harvesting the DNA, will there be informed consent? This bill is a massive breach of human rights. Sharing information with other government departments is just one example of that clearly demonstrates the lack of consideration of the principles of informed consent. I put it to the House that there has not been enough careful thought and consideration involved in the writing of this bill. I rest with one simple question: do the advantages of the proposed bill outweigh the limitations and likely disadvantages? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Yarraman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House of the Big Data Bill 2022 for its power to enhance government decision-making to optimise efficiency and effectiveness. COVID-19 has forced more interactions online, thus greater reliance on technology, creating a data abundance and digital connectivity across the planet. We, as the government, must be aware of big data's potential as a form of new currency to transform technological advancements. As a rapidly evolving field that offers significant opportunities when explored and applied to further the government's ability to correctly deliver optimal civil, social, educational and health outcomes. Due to big data's ability to survey land use, as outlined in Clause 8A of the proposed legislation, vegetation and stock numbers will be greatly affected in the Yarraman region. Importantly, Yarraman has a strong agricultural society that can be supported through big data to manage and distribute resources effectively. We look forward to passing this bill to not only improve the Yarraman electorate, but Queensland's ability to implement necessary change effectively. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Naran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House of growing concerns surrounding Clause 6, outlining the purposes for which data can be collected and stored. This bill, if passed without amendments to Clause 6, will infringe on Section 25 of the Human Rights Act 2019, which grants one the right to privacy and the right to not have their reputation unlawfully attacked. While there are legitimate law enforcement reasons for retaining DNA collected as proposed by Clause 6B and 6C, there are no such reasons to justify the collection and storage of DNA through broader police and community data drives alongside public safety and welfare programs. People have the right to privacy, and that right will be infringed if DNA is collected and stored under Clause 6D and 6E. There are no legitimate reasons for the storage and collection of DNA data in those circumstances which outweighs an individual's right to privacy. Aside from the infringement of Section 25 of the Human Rights Act, the collection of DNA under Clause 6 poses a variety of ethical concerns. One of these concerns that arises under Clause 6 is that there are no legislated safeguard measures in place that ensure the agreed or consensual use of a person's DNA by a third-party company. This means that our citizens have no protection against big organisations. What will Queensland become if we passed this bill? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Karen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to inform the House of Part 4, Clause 6 of the Big Data Bill 2022. Section A provides the community with equal and fair opportunities to have their DNA taken and stored in a safe manner. As a result of the process being voluntary, the rights of individuals is balanced by the rights of privacy and safety of society. Unlike informal social media outlets, the government will have strong safeguards in place to control the way that it manages this information as a result of today's advancing technology. DNA collection is necessary in the case of a crime scene or missing person case. These cases have detrimental impact on families, so we must ensure DNA collection is stored in order to solving these cases efficiently and accurately, while providing a clear answer for grieving families. If your loved one was subject to a crime like this, wouldn't DNA collection put your mind at ease rather than worrying and asking questions that could not be answered? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Stone.
Mr. Speaker, the costs outweigh the benefits. The issue at the crux of this debate is whether it is secure, efficient and just to implement a system where big data is stored to monitor a variety of daily movements, from crop farming to trips in an individual's car. The simple answer is no. There are a few issues with the bill I'd like to raise in my motion to oppose today. Namely, I move to question whether the bill does in fact uphold the right to privacy as it so claims to. Firstly, a contradiction within the bill should be brought to light in the fact that while it emphasises that nominating one's data is optional, all owners of motor vehicles would necessarily be forced to automatically provide their trip data. It is vital to maintain the right to privacy of Australians across all aspects of the bill, not just some. To implement compulsory vehicle tracking is a considerable step against the key values of democracy, and therefore this aspect is flawed. Next, I move to question how the government, a government that has had its systems infiltrated in the past, plans on securing the tremendously fragile data of its people. Especially when it is put forward that third-party provided equipment would need to be used to record the data. The personal information of Australians is incredibly important. How does the government plan on ensuring that data is not acquired by third-party organisations in its transmission to the department? Considering how substantial the role of third parties is in data harvesting processes, it seems unrealistic to assume that these organisations would not somehow gain access to the data. It is for these reasons that I move to oppose the bill put forward today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Youth Member. I call the Youth Member for Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House why the Big Data Bill is important and that it is integrated into our society. Clause 1A states that the object of this Act is to harness the power of big data to maximise the efficiency and effectiveness of government services and projects to provide vital resources and assistance to specified target populations and individuals. You and your family are part of those target populations. Wouldn't this improve your quality of life? Our country is a great nation and it can be made even better through the use of big data. This bill opens up a multitude of pathways and strategies to maximise accuracy in influencing decisions to benefit the whole of the country. Although the bill possesses an air of ominous proceedings, many people see it as the government spying on us. That is not true. This bill is to benefit the whole of the country and help us. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Pascoe.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House on the need to reject the passing the bill in its current form. The object of the Act in Clause 4 is broad and lacks clarity in order to ensure Queensland citizens' right to privacy are maintained. Within Clause 4.2d, data will be harvested and monitored in regard to health and education. However, the scope of this application is not explicitly outlined. Additionally, there are issues in the drafting of the bill regarding the use of data. Despite the statement of compatibility accompanying the bill, indicating Queensland citizens' right to privacy pursuant to Section 25 of the Human Rights Act is complied with, it is still too vague to determine what limitations and scope the sharing of data across these government departments will be. More transparency embedded in the legislation is necessary, with the provision outlining which government organisations will actually have access to this specific data, to ensure that there is not a privacy leakage risk. With the establishment of DREAD, I pose the question if there is really a need for this government body, considering it would be funded by taxpayer funds also. Another layer of bureaucracy through the establishment of DREAD may create confusion. For example, how harvested data could be accessed. The method in which data could be accessed through the drone technology and DNA would not address the public well-being on the basis of COVID as suggested. The separation of these may enhance clarity, as done within the current system. Thus, the establishment of the proposed department is futile. I urge the House to reconsider that there is no urgency to pass this bill in its current form. Whilst the broader purpose of efficiency is not disputed, there needs to be more transparent mechanisms built into the legislation before it should pass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Weir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention of the House to the enormous potential that the Big Data Bill presents for the people of Queensland. Living in the western suburbs of Brisbane, we are constantly plagued by traffic congestion caused by the population explosion in the west. Hours are wasted each day in bumper-to-bumper traffic on the Centenary Highway, hours that could be far better spent doing literally anything else. This bill will allow for improved investigation of traffic flow to ensure that government funds are spent effectively to alleviate these concerns. Not only this, but the surveillance will ensure that if accidents occur, emergency response teams can be notified immediately rather than waiting for a witness to call. Quicker response times means congestion can be cleared quicker, a positive all around. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to compel the House to consider repealing and amending the Big Data Bill of 2022. Despite the overall need to increase government access to data for the overall good of the population, Clause 6 is not in proportion with the rest of the bill. It states that any DNA the government come across can be collected and stored, whilst if that is refused by the individual, they must still provide DNA to DREAD for collection and identification. This provisional note on Clause 6 states that the DNA will be stored confidentially, although it will also be used across a number of different services and doesn't specify how DNA will be kept confidential if all departments have access to it.
Although other big data collection and access will help serve medical purposes for the overall COVID-19 demands, the compulsory collection of DNA violates the right to privacy and erodes any proportional test. Under Part 6 of Clause 9, big data is defined as massive amounts of digital information, which does not apply to DNA, as it is defined as self-replication material for nearly all living organisms. To repeal all of Clause 6 will amend the Big Data Bill to still allow the collection of big data, but not data that is so unique to the individual and therefore is excessive in comparison with the data stated in the other clauses. As a result, I urge the House to consider, if this bill must pass, that necessary amendments to the DNA provision occur so that it accords with human rights. The provisions are still too vague to enable members of Queensland to have full confidence that the government, when exercising their powers, will collect, hold and treat Queensland citizens' DNA with the required care and privacy. Mr. Speaker, the rights to privacy of Queensland citizens are too valuable during the current COVID state, and therefore Clause 6 must be amended if this bill is to pass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Fitzroy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to share with the House the importance of the passing of the Big Data Bill. I voice my support for this bill due to how it benefits my electorate of Fitzroy. The Specialist Department of Dread will oversee the management of data, as outlined in Clause 5. The implementation of DNA databank storage will greatly assist the criminal justice system. With federal authorities having access to DNA, potential suspects can be identified or eliminated more efficiently. Many other departments also are assisted by this DNA storage system. A prime example of this is within healthcare. With healthcare departments having access to the DNA data, treatments for patients can be identified faster. Drone technology has been deemed as the latest solution to environmental sustainability monitoring. The satellite and drone surveillance outlined in Clause 8 of the bill capitalises on this new technology, yielding many environmental benefits. In summary, the aims of the Big Data Bill clearly show why it should be passed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call the youth member for Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The proposed bill denies people their internationally recognised UDHR outlined human right to privacy and sounds like something from a horrific dystopian novel. Many aspects of this bill are deeply and inherently flawed, but today I will specifically focus on Clause 8, which details satellite surveillance as part of big data. Firstly, note the wording of this clause. Including indicates that while drones can be used for the environmental listed purposes, they can also legally be used for anything else, potentially malicious or invasive. This power must be limited. And even if we accept the government is and will continue to act in a benign manner, despite consistent historic indications otherwise, there is a disturbing history of protected data being illicitly accessed by others, such as the infamous 2016 hacking of the census. There is no guarantee of safety for precious private data. Esteemed peers, if you stand for privacy and trust, you stand against this bill. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Zamir.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the benefits of passing Big Data Bill for both Queensland and its community. Passing this bill will mean a huge increase in public safety, as statistics reveal that DNA profiling reduces the probability of future convictions by 17%. The process of DNA profiling will involve generating a large database and the identification of criminals or possible suspects. DNA technology is increasingly vital to ensuring accuracy and fairness in the criminal justice system, as it can be employed to clear suspects and exonerate people mistakenly accused or convicted of a crime. Therefore, passing the Big Data Bill will pave the way for improving the efficiency and reliability of the criminal justice system to better serve and protect the well-being of Queensland citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Normanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw to the attention of the House that under Part 4, Clause 6C, that big data would be used for the compulsory collection, entry and identification of data for the purposes of excluding individuals from police inquiries. However, this collection procedure is flawed, as DNA evidence must first be identified and stored within the software, which may lead to the extension of necessary inquiries for the sole purpose of finding a DNA match. These extended time periods also lead to the capacity for errors to be made within urgent inquiries. As big data stores large quantities of confidential information, the requirements for conducting procedures to uphold the maximum privacy for Queensland residents must be stated in legislative documents. May I also inform the House that Part 5, Clause 8, requires further amendments. Specification for the use of drones and satellite surveillance to achieve environmental objectives is unclear. The scope of using technological advancements has not been clarified in the legislation. I finally draw attention to the lack of clarity surrounding the accessibility of big data. Although these data findings will not be for public use, it is unclear as to which exact government departments have authority to access this data. This data, especially data containing DNA evidence, imposes on the privacy of Queenslanders through the compulsory submission of data. Under Section 24 of the Human Rights Act, which may be seen in the notes of this bill, a person must not be arbitrarily deprived of their property, referring to their DNA. Furthermore, this bill needs to be amended to reduce the ambiguity and to outline procedures for implementing this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Severn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the bill. The Big Data Bill will allow the Queensland Government to support our people and improve the quality of all government services. We as a representative democracy elect our leader to improve and change Queensland, and with this bill alone, it will allow the government to drastically improve our state. A common thought about data and its usage by the government is that it's an invasion of privacy, but this data is key in developing quality, personalised services that can further the Queensland people and act in our best interest. This data is necessary for ensuring the government is financially supporting the areas that Queensland believes aren't supported well enough. It is required to help the government understand the effects of COVID and how we as a whole can move forward from the pandemic. It is needed for a better Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Saltwater.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I draw to the attention of the House Part 4, Clause 6 on civil and social welfare provision. Mr. Speaker, I put to the House that this clause in fact poses a threat to the welfare of our civil and social society, rather than, as it purports, providing for it. I rise today to inform the House of a contradiction in terms between Clause 6A and Clause 6E, which I put to you is a sign that there is an insidiousness about the motives for this bill in its entirety. This contradiction mentions in Section 6A that DNA will be collected from individuals at any time on a voluntary basis and stored with identification. And a mere 4 points later, 6E states that DNA may be compulsorily collected and identified, which allows a broad discretion as to when it can be invoked. I ask the government, Mr. Speaker, what compelling argument in the interest of civil and social welfare provision would there be to compulsorily require an individual to permit their DNA to be collected? While those opposite will point out the benefits of this bill, it has potential to become a wolf in sheep's clothing. It leaves room for the government to use it to further their political or social policy goals, potentially leading to discrimination, targeting of individuals or oppression. While technological and scientific innovation are to be encouraged, they should never be used to undermine the civil liberties of our population. I ask the House, if we say yes to big data, are we saying yes to Big Brother? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any members who wish to speak on this particular debate who have not yet spoken? Honourable members, the only person who gets to speak twice is the Minister who has carriage of the bill. I now call the Youth Minister for the Information Economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current legislation regarding DNA testing, storage and destruction involving the criminal investigation process could be regarded as a breach of an individual's privacy. However, I ask you this: what is there to hide? The protection of society regarding crime rates and recidivism in Queensland alone must be prioritised, and the Big Data Bill of 2022 will certainly further enhance civil and social welfare provisions. Many individuals trust genealogy organisations where they are unaware of who is managing the company, hence privacy concerns regarding big data on a state level should be disregarded. Prioritising the safety of society reduces reoffender statistics, solves unsolved criminal crime cases, either proves innocent or guilt, and provides justice. Further supporting this, the Golden State Killer case was solved due to a GED match, family connections, and extensive police research, where many families received justice and the suspect was found guilty due to a decade-old DNA sample linking him to various crimes, including murder. The Big Data Bill further supports the idea of bringing justice to victims of crime and individuals found guilty that are later proven innocent. DNA must be stored in support of our ever-changing society where the safety of our citizens matters far more than privacy. I ask you this, what would you rather? A criminal's DNA be taken without their knowledge and be found tied to a string of serious offences, or never be found guilty because of privacy concerns that should have already considerably been ignored? Whether you realise it or not, big data is already being used in our daily lives. The digital footprint of customers reveal an incredible amount of useful information regarding their preferences, needs, and purchase behaviour. Businesses already use big data to observe consumers' patterns and then tailor their products to services according to their specific customer needs. This ensures customer satisfaction, loyalty, and ultimately a considerable boost in sales. Big data plays a critical role in developing effective risk management processes and strategies. Big data analytics and tools promptly reduce risks by optimizing complex decisions and unexpected events and potential threats. Further, I would like to reiterate the argument that companies are already recruiting more cybersecurity professionals to protect their data. Other steps taken for securing data include data encryption, data segregation, identity and access control, implementation of endpoint security, security monitoring, and the use of big data security tools such as the IBM Guardian. I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you, Youth Minister. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Those that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Bureaucratic Information Gathering, Data Access Technology and Application Bill 2022.
Honourable youth members, we'll now move to the private member statements. This is an opportunity to raise issues of importance to your local community. I call the youth member for Calliope.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House of the issue occurring in Calliope. A recent town meeting shows that locals across the region raise concerns about the ambulance delays, surgery cancellations and long wait lists. These concerns are predominantly based on the lack of medical facilities. Currently in Calliope, there is a local medical centre that is not run 24 hours a day and a small ambulance bay. Although the medical centre is currently operational, more recently there was no general practitioner's office in a town with a population of over 5,000. Although these facilities seem sufficient for a small town, there are still concerns for the medical legibility of the town. The nearest hospital is a 20-minute drive from Calliope, and with 20% of the population being 50 and older, this continues to be an issue. Although there have been many steps to improve the situation in Calliope, there is more that can be done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Herbert.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Not only is this an issue for my electorate, but for the whole of Queensland. Years and years have had our generation pleading for your help, yet you continue to ignore our cries. Since the Industrial Revolution, global climate temperatures have increased by an alarming 45%. For us living in Queensland, this looks like uncontrollable bushfires, droughts and floods. What we have recently witnessed will only get worse. Underwater heat waves are killing our beautiful Great Barrier Reef and our surrounding ocean that gives us 50% of the world's oxygen. Our native animals will become endangered and soon extinct. Our ecosystems will be damaged. Our fishery, cattle and agriculture industries ruined. You have promised Queenslanders a net zero future by 2050, so stop signing agreements that will contribute to the release of carbon emissions. What is stopping you from making this agreement legally binding? Action your promises. If myself, my children, and the next generation's existence in this world means burning a small hole in the economy of carbon emission production, I reckon that's a pretty fair trade. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I rise to inform the House of a concern regarding the upgrade of the Tamborine-Oxenford Road. This is a crucial arterial road that links the Gold Coast and Scenic Rim. However, it has for many years been prone to flood damage and erosion. Due to the recent floods, the area has once again eroded, causing the Tamborine-Oxenford Road to be dangerous and unsafe. I do acknowledge that both the state and federal governments have contributed towards upgrading this road to improve safety and increase flood immunity. However, my primary concerns come from the constant delays occurring in this project. Local residents and tourists have been impacted by the floods and consequent erosion of this road for over a decade, and if something isn't done, the issue will only get worse. Due to climate change, there has been a 7% increase in water vapour in the atmosphere, resulting in an increase of projected floods. This issue cannot be put aside for any longer, so I call for more urgency to be brought about in this project to ensure the safety and convenience of the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Sator.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to bring an issue to the attention of the House. Section 29 of the Corrective Services Act Queensland states that a female prisoner who will give birth during her sentence can apply for custody of her child. If successful, she will raise her child within the prison. There is currently no way for the justice system to ensure that the child will have access to food, nappies, education, or safe accommodation after they leave prison. There needs to be more programs and assistance given to mothers and their children during and after they leave prison. It must be noted that one of the main principles of prison is rehabilitation. Mr. Speaker, having such few programs of this nature contradicts one of the main principles that the justice system was built on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the attention of the House to the recent events of the Queensland inquiry into police responses to family and domestic violence. This inquiry was established in response to the recommendations made by the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force report, Hear Her Voice. On May 10 this year, the Queensland Premier stated, "Countless lives have been saved because of the men and women of our police service, but many survivors report they did not receive an adequate response at their particular point in time." Similarly, an ABC report identified that police officers were responding with derogatory comments to victims and conducted incomplete investigations. Due to these circumstances, we, the government, conducted the inquiry to ensure the public feels safe in their homes and have full confidence in the ability of our police officers to protect victims and hold perpetrators accountable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Pike.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Queensland's teacher shortage has been steadily worsening, but has come to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic. Models from the Queensland Government suggest a statewide shortage as high as 1,700 teachers within 3 years, whilst data from 2019 showed that 1 in 4 teachers left the industry within 3 years of entry. These problems are exponentially worse in regional areas. One consequence of this problem is that teachers are overloaded through additional responsibilities, such as covering other roles, something which I have witnessed firsthand. Not only does this impact the teachers' well-being, but students' education can be negatively impacted as teachers have less time to prepare for lessons. Solutions to mitigate this problem include more incentivisation through increased wages, more funding to public schools, shortening course length at university, and supplying more student teachers. As of now, the inaction of the Queensland Government is stretching many schools to their breaking points. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the mental health of Queensland youth. In Queensland, mental health issues amongst youth are on the rise. As of 2020, over a quarter of our young people are facing psychological distress. Two out of the three most significantly detrimental conditions for young people are anxiety disorders and depressive disorders. And along with this, since 2014, school engagement and attendance has declined across multiple states, including Queensland. The youth mental health crisis is not disappearing. While schools can be the cause of mental health issues amongst youth, we can also support schools to be the solution. Schools are the front lines for addressing mental health issues, as they are a crucial part of those foundational years as a young person. Mental health education draws from evidence-based practice to support young learners who have lived or are living with mental health issues. Mr. Speaker, Queensland legislation must be amended to mandate mental health education, and to increase staff support systems in schools. Increased funding must be allocated to training all teachers and staff in relation to juvenile mental health and to providing access to trauma-informed education experts. It is fundamental for the well-being of Queensland's youth that we adopt better practices to improve the mental health of our youth by way of education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Annan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For how long can we continue to brutally criminalise, that is, offer prison sentences of up to 15 years, the possession of marijuana? What we know is that marijuana is a drug that causes relatively low harm to the general community. To illustrate this, we must look at the deaths attributed to it per year in comparison to the widely accepted and legislated in favour of drug, alcohol. One drug was attributed to over 5,000 deaths in 1 year in Australia alone, whilst the other caused a little over 500 deaths over a period of 19 years. Mr. Speaker, cannabis was the latter. Cannabis, the dangerous drug that simply must be restricted. We must be honest with ourselves. Restricting access to cannabis to the black market only achieves one thing. It acts as a possible gateway for potential users to try more dangerous and impactful substances. It creates a connection to dealers, a community and a mindset. That is, that the criminal underworld is a solution to people's problems. By legalising and taxing this drug, society will broadly benefit. This will clearly lead to a more safe, free and regulated society for every single one of our constituents.
Well said. I call the youth member for Bremer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on the uncomfortable reality that men don't cry, men carry no emotions, and men have to suffer in silence. I am passionate about reducing the stigma associated with mental health and decreasing the suicide rates among men. Evidence shows that 75% of those who take their own life are male. This is a prominent issue as men are thought to be the strong pillar to lean on in society. That can fix problems and deal with their own alone. Evidence shows that men often aren't encouraged to talk about their feelings and often shy away from vulnerable conversations. But trying to guard it alone when you're feeling depressed, it is a high risk factor for suicide and is a contributing factor to the big difference in suicide rates between men and women. The stigma associated with men's mental health is causing men to be far less likely to seek mental health treatment, which is highlighted through suicide being the leading cause of death for men between the ages of 15 and 44 in Queensland. This matter is even more pressing considering that Indigenous men are more than 2 times more likely to suffer from depression than non-Indigenous men. So today, I've risen to ask you to ask yourself, what are you doing to stop this stigma? Are you someone that male family members and friends can lean on shamelessly? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, past, present, and emerging. Because when I acknowledge the land I stand on, I acknowledge the importance of Indigenous people within Australia. And yet, people are still struggling to educate and understand the history of this country. At Lockhart, a huge hurdle they are facing is the low rates of attendance their schools are presented with. Schools such as Lockhart State School are shown that only half the students' population is attending their classes. Why? Well, when many of us use the excuse that it is a community problem, not a government one, we are deliberately ignoring the fact of the past. I am referring to the fact that many Indigenous parents do still have the existing nightmare or the long-term view that education will take their kids away from them and their tribes. When we hold the responsibility of giving education to Indigenous children ourselves through school, it builds a growing fear. While we hope for all the young children within Lockhart to receive adequate education, it does not mean the only way is by bringing them to school. The leaders within Lockhart should be given funds to support the Indigenous people's path to creating education within their communities, allowing the agency to shape the education system of their youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for South Pine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the Queensland current health system, which is currently in crisis. Figures from the Queensland Health show that in the last June quarter, 45% of patients were left in an ambulance at an emergency department for more than 30 minutes. The entire health system is again buckling. Nurses and other workers are chronically overworked, infection controls are breaking down, and staff are being shunned into areas in which they are not trained. Not to mention, thousands of Australians are being left on waiting lists due to repeated shutdowns of elective surgery. Currently, there are almost 58,000 Queenslanders on the elective surgery list, 7,500 of which are overdue, leaving these poor Queenslanders in pain and suffering without an end in sight. Even the president of the Australian Medical Association Queensland said that just because someone's surgery isn't considered non-urgent does not mean that their injury or illness has no profound impact on their quality of life. I call on this government to finally start acting on our failing health system. We need to stop blaming COVID and we need to start adapting and finding solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Sandy.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Today, I want to inform the House of the benefits of the Big Data Bill to the state's land management and development. According to the Sunshine Coast Council, from 2011 to 2021, over 84,000 people moved to the Sunshine Coast, and this number is forecasted to increase to at least 500,000 people by 2041. In preparation for this high-density living, it is vital that we maintain the livability and enhance the natural environment of our region. Through the use of drones and civil surveillance tools used for land surveying, aerial mapping, public surveillance and more. These tools will collect vital environmental data to preserve ecosystems and maintain the natural beauty and landscape of Queensland for generations to come, whilst also allowing for city leaders to be able to quickly adjust to trends in population growth so that basic services can be provided to everyone. So if we hope to reach the climate change target for governments and protect the land for future generations to come, these technologies and the Big Data Bill are more important than ever. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Gilead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to compel the House to consider an initiative that will revolutionise the way Queenslanders live. 100 years ago, we moved from working 6 days a week to 5, and we are already overdue for an update. The pandemic made it clear that if we can change where we work, we can change how we work. 4 days of work, 5 days of pay sounds too good to be realistic, but it's not. Companies and governments around the world have initiated trials of reduced work weeks, with results proving that workers are less stressed, they value their jobs more, and they are just as productive in 4 days of work as they are in 5.
Hear, hear.
For employees, this change promises to improve work-life balance, and with collaboration between businesses, employees, researchers, and the Queensland Government, we can create a new way of working which will increase productivity, worker satisfaction, and produce a sustainable work environment. I know I would have liked to have this Friday off, and I'm sure the rest of Queensland would have too. So we can make that permanent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, youth member. It's something I wish we would do more of. The House will now adjourn for morning tea. Honourable members, there are 9 clauses. I propose to call the clauses. If any member wishes to speak to any of those particular clauses, they will need to indicate through me as the Speaker. The question is that clauses 1 to 5, as read, stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. think the ayes have it. The question is that Clause 6 is read stand part of the bill. I call the Youth Shadow Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I move Amendment Number 1 circulated in my name. Delete Clause 6A, Clause 6C, Clause 6D and Clause 6E. Insert new Clause 6A. Clause 6A. With the exception of DNA retrieved from a crime scene, DNA will only be collected with the individual's full knowledge, understanding and informed consent, and will be stored for a maximum of 3 years. Mr. Speaker, it is generally accepted that there are many benefits that may occur from the creation and use of big data in the public sector. However, the rights of individuals are under greater threat than ever, and we must ensure that we protect these rights even more zealously than we have in the past. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Colin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to add a point as to why I think Amendment Number 2 would be beneficial. The idea of importing the state Queensland unique identifier device into every vehicle can lead to various opportunities, such as the showing of data where people travel the most and which roads are the busiest. With this data, the government will be able to see where safety measures are mostly needed and where accidents are most likely to occur. This would help the government identify roads where emergency or towing services are mainly needed. In addition, this can show what locations are most visited and the time places are usually busy. This can help the government plan around these areas in terms of adding alternative transport routes or changing existing ones to make traveling to these places safer and quicker. This would help reduce traffic congestion around these busy areas, and it will also help TransLink look at where they could add public transport where it's mostly needed. Knowing the traffic around specific areas will help make decisions on where expenditure is needed the most, depending on how busy these areas are or are not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to give leave to the Youth Shadow Attorney General. I call the Youth Shadow Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Objectively, such amendment will protect individuals' ownership of their own DNA. With DNA being collected with the full knowledge, consent and understanding of the owner, none shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with their privacy, thus upholding the rights and freedoms of individuals. Such legislation restricts the opportunity for businesses and providers to, without owner knowledge, access big data, inclusive of phone numbers, third-party access to data and forms of tracking. The implementation of big data violates the principles of privacy, as found in the Privacy Act 1988, to manipulate citizens and increase social stratification without consent. This amendment works zealously to protect rights of individuals regarding big data in the public sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Pioneer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the opposition member for Pioneer, I rise to speak on Amendment 1. When you volunteer a tube of your spit or a cheek swab, you are giving away your full genetic code. Every cell on that cheek swab carries the full sequence of your DNA, including the mutation pattern that makes it uniquely yours. It's the most valuable thing you own, so it's important that restrictions are placed on its collection and storage. Hence, we propose 3 years as the maximum time for storage of volunteered DNA. We are told to trust that governments will not misuse data they collect. Recently, in USA, a state judge forced a public genealogy site, GED Match, to allow police to search its entire database of DNA profiles. A detective wanted to find a distant relative of a serial rapist in hopes that their family tree could help him hone in on one suspect. Even though most of the 1.3 million people who have shared their DNA data with the site haven't agreed to such a search. This search warrant was reported by the New York Times, raises the alarming possibility of similar police searches of giant direct-to-consumer DNA sites, such as Ancestry.com and 23andMe, that are now closed to everyone except for the company customers who willingly submit a saliva sample. Police in China are collecting blood samples from men and boys from across the country to build a genetic map of its roughly 700 million males, giving the authorities a powerful new tool for their emerging high-tech surveillance state. This project is a major escalation of China's efforts to use genetics to control its people, which have been focused on tracking ethnic minorities and other more targeted groups. It is important in Australia to protect individuals' ownership of their own DNA.
I call the Youth Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable youth members, the Leader of the Opposition raised arguments earlier that this Act will give way to abuses of power in government and institutions and cause detriment to the average Queenslander. This contradicts my point. Rather, the principles that the Leader of the Opposition outlined, in fact, reinforce the point I bring to the floor today. The full potential of DNA collection, storing, and identification is not only in the interest of public safety, but promotes transparency and responsibility in our strong institutions and in our federal and state governments. The opposition asked the floor for a legitimate reason for the implementation of the clause as it stands, Clause 6. Through Clause 6 as it stands, DNA collection will be used to trace government and institutional bodies back to their actions and decisions. The upholdance of this security, where it cannot be removed from archive by nature or removed from archive by undue influence or malicious motive, ensures that key decision makers are held accountable and meet consequence and retribution for any corruption, unregulation, or actions against the interest of all of Queensland that they may bring. Limiting the time in the amendment proposed by the Shadow Attorney General, limiting the time that this DNA collection can be stored will only infringe upon the possibility for this Act to bring the most of accountability and transparency to our strong institutions to ensure that they are peaceful and that they are just. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable members, data saves lives. I rise to inform the House on the importance of big data in relation to the abilities of Queensland's public sector. The Department of Trade, equipped with the power and capacity to harness big data, ensures confidentiality in the collection and monitoring of health data, maximising the government's ability to make crucial decisions regarding community welfare. If we limit the amount of retrieved DNA for our police force, the reproductions also affect our health system. A global pandemic was unprecedented, and COVID-19 continues to shine a light on Queensland's lack of data collection and collation systems. A developed system to manage and apply data quickly appeared as a priority. If previously established, data regarding the prevalence of COVID-19 within Australian communities would have aided in tracking the spread and mitigating deaths. Privacy is deemed irrelevant if it ensures lives are being saved. DNA also saves innocent people from being prosecuted and identifies guilty individuals. Hospitalisation, death and case numbers aided our government's decisions during the pandemic, and DNA greatly aids our police force. The availability of big data guarantees beneficial targeted spending and influences our governmental decisions. I urge the House to disregard this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Wenlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak against the Amendment Number 1 to the Big Data Bill 2022. This amendment is unnecessary as it argues that after 3 years, DNA that is consensual and collected by the government to be used as a resource should be discarded of. DNA samples have many purposes, especially through the recent pandemic. It's necessary to have DNA samples for open durations, as the use of it in the scientific field is ever growing with new diseases and viruses arising. Samples are used as a vital source in research, and humans have been using this as a foundation of information for decades. In the field of archaeology, researchers' findings regarding human remains discovered are not disposed of every 3 years, as it is a key factor to future research. Rather, it's stored, similar to how DNA is. This amendment will only cause disruption in the Queensland Government's ability to deliver optimal environmental and health outcomes, and as the previous bill already abides by relevant legislation and human rights, it is redundant to change it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Georgina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the drawbacks of the First Amendment to the bill. There are a number of flaws I'd like to point out that have not been addressed. Firstly, the fact is that removing Clause 6, A, C, D, and E reduces the specificity of the bill, allowing for it to be misconstrued within the judicial system. As well as this, the proposed amendment results in the law becoming more unjust, as it unfairly discriminates against one societal group and reduces the effectiveness of the law. The aim of this bill is to harness the power of big data to provide vital resources and assistance. But this cannot be done under the amendment to the best of its ability because of the vagueness the amendment results in. And so, as the original clause allows the law to achieve its wanted outcomes while providing the necessary safety and privacy securities, the bill must not be amended. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And I call the youth member for Baffle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government genuinely and firmly believes that this amendment will be highly beneficial to all Queensland citizens, as it will protect individuals' ownerships of their own data. Simply put, DNA collection and use is something that can be welcomed, not feared. What should be feared is high and increasing crime rates. Appropriate DNA collection can be used to lower these crime rates we all fear. DNA has and can solve crimes quicker than other methods, and therefore should be welcomed. The quicker criminals are caught and punished, the greater the deterrent is for them against committing crimes in the future. The government is not seeking to use DNA for broader purposes that may be considered antisocial or that may breach privacy or human rights generally. The safeguard that DNA will normally only be collected with a person's full consent should act to ensure the Queensland public that this amendment does not have any potential sinister intentions. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to say I give my support to the government's bill and this particular amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any members who wish to speak to this clause?
I seek to make a point of order.
What is your point of order, member?
I'm being misrepresented. I want to make a correction to the House. I am actually the Shadow Minister for Information Economy, not the Leader of the Opposition. And
Sorry, member, it's not possible for you to make a point of order in that regard. You can either take offence to something that a member has said. If you take offence to something that a member has said.
No, I do not.
Okay, well, please resume your seat. I will now put the question. The question is that amendment number 1, moved by the Youth Shadow Attorney General, be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no? No. I think the noes have it.
Divide.
A division has been called. Ring the bells. Close the bars. While that's being done, members, the bars are not what you think. They're the bars that separate you from the chamber. There's no drinks involved. The question is that the amendment number 1 moved by the Youth Shadow Attorney General be agreed to, for which a division has been called. I appoint the government whip to act as teller for the noes and the opposition whip to act as teller for the ayes.
There are 55 ayes.
Well, I call the government whip.
55 ayes.
I call the opposition whip.
37 noes, Mr. Speaker.
The opposition has failed in this division. The division is resolved in the negative. Members will resume their seats. The question is that clause 7, as read, stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. No. I think the ayes have it. The question is that clause 8, as read, stand part of the bill. I call the Youth Minister for Transport and Main Roads.
Mr. Speaker, I move amendment number 2 circulated in my name. Insert new clause 8B. All new vehicles imported into Queensland must have a State of Queensland unique identifier device installed. This device will be retrofitted into older vehicles as a condition of re-registration. Mr. Speaker, the government has listened to feedback we have received from the community on this legislation, and it is clear that Queenslanders can see clear benefits to introducing this measure to improve the quality of our roads and ease traffic congestion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any other members who wish to speak to that particular amendment? I call the youth member for Cliffdale. I call the youth member for Transport and Main Roads.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The implementation of the State of Queensland Unique Identifier Devices, also known as SQIDs, will allow the government to easily track where cars are mostly used so that we can better maintain the roads through our towns and cities. Along with that benefit, the introduction of SQIDs will allow the police force to better track missing vehicles with the SQIDs installed, with the cars linking to information on the big data database. Amendment number 2, circulated in my name, allows us to collect and appropriately use these SQIDs on all vehicles to better improve our department. And this is a key feature in improving the driving quality of our roads and determining whether cars and roads are safe for use. Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Youth Minister. I call the youth member for Cliffdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister of Cliffdale, I agree with aspects of Amendment 1, but I have issue with the length of time proposed for the storage of DNA data. We believe that a 3-year time period isn't long enough to draw out as much information from the data as possible, in accordance with what the bill aims to achieve. To be able to adequately analyse and compare DNA over time, it is recommended that the storage of the data is more than 3 years. We advise 10 to 15 years for the data to be stored, in order to use the data to its full potential. Comparison of DNA data over a longer period of time allows for an in-depth analysis of raw data to reach reliable conclusions for the health industry. As a member of this government, I believe that Amendment 2 should be moved by the Youth Minister for Transport and Main Roads. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, youth member. I call the youth member for Peru.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Amendment 2, Clause 8B, and seek to raise only one primary issue with the passing of this bill, that the privacy of Queensland citizens could be jeopardised. On page 18, under subtitle, Alternative Ways of Achieving the Policy Objectives, this bill states ways in which we already come across this data, through things such as transponders that record how many vehicles use specific roads, etc. By considering the introduction of this invasive measure of fitting all Queensland cars with a unique identifier device to essentially come across the same statistics, one can only assume that the devices are additionally being used for different purposes then. Is it to track certain people's whereabouts? But if we can track these people, what's to stop experienced cryptographers, by which I mean hackers, from also accessing this data for other people? What's to stop hackers from targeting innocent Queensland citizens for any myriad of reasons? And what's to stop them from tracking where important members of Parliament are at all times? Think of what they could do with this information. Privacy would no longer be a viable option, not for any of you and not for anyone else. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Ballyando.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the significance of Amendment 2 within Big Data Bill 2022. The second amendment regarding the installation of a State of Queensland Unique Identifier Device, or SQID, within all vehicles is crucial in providing us with an increased understanding of how communities across Queensland use the roads. With the data able to determine things such as which roads are used most and peak times of traffic, this would allow us to understand the needs of our fellow Queenslanders and open discussions for increasing road efficiency and safety in places which may not have had adequate attention earlier. Big data is already doing wonders on the roads, with Tim Stenovic from Tech Insight expressing just how he feels glee and satisfaction with his Google Maps is able to use its large database to get him home as efficiently as possible. The second amendment would similarly allow Queenslanders to benefit from the information provided by SQID, such as when vehicles are on the road, time taken to travel through specific locations, and more. This system would be regularly checked and monitored for appropriate usage by the Department of Data Retrieval, Extraction, Analysis and Distribution, as mentioned in Part 4. It's time we merge into the lane of the future and achieve the objective of this bill to maximise the efficiency and effectiveness of government services. Services for Queenslanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Ironsley.
Mr. Speaker and fellow members, this Amendment 2, Clause 8 of the State of Queensland Unique Identifier Device, affectionately called SQID by the government, is not interesting nor needed in vehicles. In fact, it is downright intrusive to the population of those who will own a new vehicle. The trust of the government is often called into question, and this just adds a layer of spying. This is uncalled for. The opposition on this stance affirmed the Minister of Transport in this clause exceeding the powers of government control to an all-time high. Already people in Queensland face the wrath of tracking devices, from their mobiles to Google Maps and various apps, and another one for cars called Squid. I ask the clause to be reconsidered as not a necessary amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Dogwood.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I inform the House of my support for Amendment 2 of the Big Data Bill. This amendment to Clause 8 has the potential for positive impacts on not only the government but the people of Queensland. The utilisation of a Squid device in the vehicles of Queensland citizens provides revolutionary technology, as data collecting software has become more prevalent throughout the duration of the COVID-19 epidemic. As it is, traffic delays are already a regular occurrence in the southeast region. The Squid devices will be used to collect vital data to help Queensland with road-related projects and services, increasing both efficiency and effectiveness. The collection of personal vehicular data will inadvertently aid specified target populations and individuals. Fitting Squid devices into older vehicles will ensure there will be an accurate representation of traffic flow and transport for common issues, such as congestion. From this stems the opportunity for areas of Queensland roads and traffic control to be further established. Squid technology can gather beneficial and proficient data to assist the government in reallocating funding to specified areas, including regional areas where there is a lack of funding for maintenance and the development of roads through the collection of data. The importance of Squid technology is a given, considering that the Queensland population is increasing exponentially, and therefore the infrastructure must also increase as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable youth members, the question is that Amendment number 2, as moved by the Youth Minister for Transport and Main Roads, be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against? No? No. I think the ayes have it.
Divide.
A division has been called. Ring the bells. Close the bars. The question is that Amendment number 2, as moved by the Youth Minister for Transport and Main Roads, be agreed to, for which a division has been called. I appoint the Government Whip to act as teller for the ayes and the Opposition Whip to act as teller for the noes. Will the honourable members please rise to report the votes?
55 ayes.
I call the Opposition Whip.
37 noes, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that the result of the division is ayes 55, noes 37. The division is a result in the affirmative. The question now is that Clause 9, as read, stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no? No. I think the ayes have it. I call the Youth Minister for the Information Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill as amended be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill as read and now amended be read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no? No. I think the ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Bureaucratic Information Gathering, Data Access, Technology and Application Bill 2022.
I call the Youth Minister for the Information Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the long title of the bill be agreed to.
The question is that the long title of the bill be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no? No. I think the ayes have it. I call the Youth Leader of the House.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
I call the Youth Member for Archer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the 2016 census, it was found that young individuals aged 12 to 24 make up 21% of those experiencing homelessness. Since the pandemic, that number has skyrocketed immensely, leaving thousands of young people on the streets every night. This issue is not one only facing my district of Archer, but the entire of Queensland and furthermore, Australia. Factors that cause this include the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation of prices, expense of living, shortage of housing, family and domestic violence, mental illness, crime, and even drug and alcohol addictions. Youth homelessness immensely affects an individual's life and impacts their access to housing, food, education, which serves as basic human rights. Not having these basic rights puts pressure on these individuals to access them through crime or other harmful and irresponsible activity, which can negatively impact community safety and law enforcement. We need to act now to supply better living conditions, housing, and overall opportunities to struggling youth to assist them in getting back on their feet. This will set these young and innocent individuals up for the best chance at success to secure their lives and deliver the quality of life every Queenslander deserves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Stanley.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to address a key issue affecting youth not only in my electorate of Stanley, but right across Queensland. Imagine going out for the night where a drunken tussle between two groups breaks out, and the next thing you know, you're lying on the floor, drowning in your own blood. While this sounds like a dystopian society, it's an unfortunate reality for too many Australians.
Hear, hear.
Since 2001, 46,448 Australians have been charged with illegally carrying a knife or other bladed weapon, and a further 40% of homicides involved a bladed weapon, making knives the most prominent murder weapon. 52% of knife owners own a knife for the purpose of self-protection, despite the Weapons Act 1990 making clear provisions against this.
Hear, hear.
Currently, knives can be purchased without lawful reason, failing to prevent an individual from carrying it on their person. Therefore, I ask the House to consider implementing an application process for the procurement of these dangerous weapons, so that the tragedy of Laui Tagaloa will not be repeated. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
I call the youth member for Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to bring to the attention of the House the unwavering issue of domestic and family violence, which appears as a tunnel with no end. Indeed, several factors lead to this devastating problem. Alcohol, drug use, previous experience with abuse, pregnancy and separation are just some examples. This issue has only been catalysed with the emergence of COVID-19 and subsequent frequent lockdowns. Queensland police officers currently spend nearly half their time, 40% to be accurate, dealing with cases of family and domestic violence. Yet since last year, we've only seen an increase in officer responses to domestic and family violence occurrences, a 6% increase totaling 114,000 cases by March of 2021. This is not only an abysmal number to have hanging over our state, but a clear sign, an indicator that the safety and security of Queensland citizens is not as resolute as it should be. While it may seem a tedious prospect, it is imperative that we remember that diverting our attention to more important issues elsewhere does not mean pre-existing ones disappear. Urgent legal reform and alternate methods of support for victims of domestic violence and family violence are crucial in cutting this issue off at its root. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Merivale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have all seen the unrest that followed the decision in Roe v. Wade being overturned in America, but Australia is far from in the clear. While Queensland has enacted the Termination of Pregnancy Act 2018 to ensure the reasonable and safe access by women to terminations of pregnancy and to regulate the conduct of registered health practitioners, more must be done to uphold women's reproductive rights. Pregnancy is a time-sensitive diagnosis, with lengthy wait times, conflicting advice, and forced travel to services having very real implications to the healthcare that prospective mothers receive. Abortion restrictions do not prevent abortions and increase the risk of unsafe procedures. If these issues are affecting those in city centres, the impact of women living in regional areas is even more amplified. With a 17-year-old in Cairns being forced to travel 1,600 kilometres for an abortion. Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk said on the issue, "I've always stood for equality. That means equality everywhere, and yet surgical termination is not available in many of Queensland's most populated towns and cities, leaving those most vulnerable abandoned. I urge the House to review abortion access across the state, as despite the decriminalisation of abortions,
Queensland's laws are still in contradiction of the state's obligation to provide women and girls with safe access to legal abortion as part of their core human rights responsibilities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bring to your attention the cost of sport to Queensland families. On average, it costs $970 for a child to play sports, such as AFL, NRL, and netball. I myself know firsthand the cost to a family as I play tennis full-time. The increased cost of living since COVID-19 has caused families to choose between paying for household expenses, such as electricity and increased prices of petrol, or being able to afford for their child to simply participate in sport. With up to 25% of Queensland children being recognised as obese, surely it is imperative that our government does something to prevent this. Assisting with the costs is our first step. Prevention is better than cure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Mooney.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I would like to bring the attention of the House to the current critical state of mental health amongst the youth. Statistics show 1 in 7 Queensland young people are struggling with their mental health. It has been recorded that 54% of mental illness in Australians goes undiagnosed. When is Queensland going to realise this rate is too high? Mental wellness is important, especially in young people. There are very few mental health centres outside the Brisbane region, limiting young people to be able to receive the help they need. It is currently a costly process, estimations between $60 to $360. If further care is needed, then the cost to be admitted into a mental health institute is the highest in Australia. Not only are the costs high, the waiting periods for most of these institutes can range between 3 to 12 months, and even then, this waiting period can be extended for months at a time, leaving people's conditions to worsen. Thankfully, there are some free services, but there is only so much they can do, which is why the Queensland Government needs to start taking action and creating more resources and institutes for mental health in our state. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Leichhardt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the House's attention towards the steep increase in youth crime. Queensland Deputy Commissioner Glockenski said that the youth justice strategy in place since 2019 has done its job in some problem areas like Logan, but change won't happen overnight. He said that 10% of repeat offenders, the ones that keep offending, have something else in their lives. These statistics are shocking and have real victims. We see the faces of these young offenders on the news every day, but we forget that these young people are just like you and me. We can't solve the problem of youth crime by simply arresting kids and putting them in jail. It's a bigger issue that needs to be addressed, where children are placed into an effective rehabilitation program that shows them that the crimes they're committing are wrong and have real and serious consequences. This would ensure effective outcomes for both young offenders and the community as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to draw the attention of the House to the issue of climate change. The Queensland Government has a duty of care to uphold over the citizens of this state, to protect us from the reasonably foreseen deterioration of our environment. Queensland has committed to 3 major targets, one being to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. These targets are significant and reachable, but the failure to genuinely commit is negligence on behalf of the state. Government figures show over 668,000 hectares of forest and bushland have been destroyed in just 1 year, 32% of which were in the Great Barrier Reef catchments. Destruction of the natural environment such as this is unacceptable. You made this choice, so take action. Because making a target will not achieve anything if it is not reached. Uphold your promise to the earth, youth, and every generation in the future, so that one day they too will be able to see pristine reefs, beaches, and rainforests which have not been destroyed by extreme weather events. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Gregory.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the misuse of student information concerning big data, creating prevalent security and privacy risks across our state jurisdiction. Although big data can be used for the good of our society, it is important to remember that it is how we use this collected information which determines whether it is beneficial or detrimental. I bring to light the abuse of big data in cases where school students have been tracked and deprived of their personal information by educational providers. This has jeopardized the safety and well-being of students who possess the right to feel protected and safe in a learning environment. And for educational content providers to take advantage of their users is an unacceptable use of big data. It is important that we are aware of the exploitation of our school students in order to protect and benefit our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Maranoa.
Thank you, Speaker. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I rise to inform the House of the unequitable assessment requirements that affect students with disabilities in mainstream schools. An example of this inequity is seen in assessment tasks involving oral presentations, which mark students based on criteria such as their pace of speaking, eye contact, and the ability to stand still without fidgeting. This is a disadvantage to students with disabilities such as ADHD and autism, as meeting those criteria is often unattainable or far more difficult for them than their peers. This results in them receiving outcomes that aren't an accurate reflection of their capabilities. Currently, the Department of Education has the Every Student with Disability Succeeding Plan 2021 to 2025. This plan mentions reasonable adjustments to assessment tasks for students with disabilities. Although access arrangements and reasonable adjustments, otherwise known as ARA, are available to make these reasonable adjustments, it is not explicitly stated on assessment task sheets. This leaves many students to be marked on a criteria that they will struggle to or cannot achieve, resulting in outcomes that don't accurately reflect their capabilities. I call on the government to ensure that ARA conditions are effectively known by students and families. Further, all Queensland schools need to effectively support students with disabilities to succeed, which includes applying and attaining an ARA. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Bowl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand before you to inform the House on the issue of water scarcity in regional Queensland. As a member for Bowl, it has come to my attention that this issue is severely threatening the welfare and overall economic security of regional businesses and residents. In recent years, our nation has come to truly appreciate the value of water, as without it, the agriculture sector simply cannot provide the valuable produce our nation so heavily relies on to both consume and export. I've heard from many residents in North Queensland who are greatly concerned about the possibility of drinking water shortfall by the middle of this decade without adequate action and investment. For too long have regional Queensland issues been forgotten about, and that is why I'm standing here today to ensure their voices are heard in Parliament. We cannot see a repeat of the drought seen in 2020, which is why action must be taken to secure our water availability and quality in our state. There has been call from many experts in the field to extend the Commonwealth Research Centre for Water Security to innovate new methods of dealing with this issue. Hence why we should look further into research programs like the CRC, rather than simply building new infrastructure like dams. I hope this issue opens up another discussion around the climate action of our state and federal governments, as this is just one of many flow-on effects of global warming. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Proserpine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to bring the issue of housing and population growth to the House. Although overseas migration has decreased due to the COVID-19 pandemic, interstate migration remains high, with growth concentrated in urban centres in southeast Queensland. While this population growth may be beneficial to the economic development of Queensland, it also necessitates greater action from the government to ensure infrastructure is keeping up with demand. This includes affordable housing, which is currently unavailable to many of the Queenslanders who need it the most. Approximately 50,000 people were on the social housing waiting list in 2022, a figure that has grown by 80% in the last 4 years. Likewise, Brisbane is expected to reach a population of 3 million people by 2030, suggesting housing needs in metropolitan Queensland will only be exacerbated in the coming years. We need to invest in the construction of at least 5,000 affordable homes each year for the next decade to ensure the issue of homelessness in Queensland is properly addressed and the welfare system is not overwhelmed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Don.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Elderly abuse consists of categories of emotional, psychological, financial, and physical abuse and neglect, while cases of purse snatching, fraud, vandalism, and financial abuse are main crimes against the elderly. Disturbingly, the case numbers of elderly abuse in DOM has risen significantly to 39.2% in 2020 to 2021. However, this only includes reported experiences of emotional and physical abuse and doesn't report any experiences of financial abuse or any other kinds towards the elderly. Once this problem was made aware of, the government implemented strategies to decrease these statistics. In 2021 to 2022, the elder abuse rate had decreased to 29.3% because of the implementations of these services. These percentages were found based on the Elder Abuse Helpline that is open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and allows the elderly population to report anything that was done wrong to them. The Queensland Government funds the Elder Abuse Prevention Unit to capture and report data regarding the elder abuse which has been used in DOM. Although these services currently are being offered and have decreased abuse rates, we need to do more. We, as the local government of DOM, are going to enrol police officers in training sessions and learn how to properly handle elderly people and how to communicate better with them to allow for police officers to support them better. We also recommend putting more staff on shifts at nursing homes and allow for the hotline to be open 24/7 rather than just 9 to 5 and on weekends as well as weekdays. We strongly urge the public to look out for their elderly neighbours and report anything that seems wrong or worrying. This is a significant ongoing issue which needs to be monitored closely, and actions will be taken in the upcoming future to prevent the rate from rising. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Sticks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise on behalf of the people to Sticks to bring an issue to the attention of the House. Public transport is one of the most key facets in the lives of all Australians, and for those of us here in Brisbane, there's no exception. This being said, I recently read a study conducted in 2018 by the University of Western Australia, which highlighted some of the major flaws in Brisbane's public transport plan. To say I was truly shocked would be an understatement. According to the paper, only 61% of residences in Brisbane are within 400 metres of a public transport stop, far below the 90% outlined in the Queensland's Priority Development Area Guidelines. Moreover, only 12% of Brisbane residences are within 400 metres of a public transport stop, with services scheduled at least every 30 minutes. Compared to Melbourne's 36%, Sydney's 35%, and Perth's 18%, we could certainly be doing a lot better for Brisbane. For most people, having to walk the extra distance to a bus stop might not be the end of the world. But for the city's elderly, sick, or disabled, this simply isn't an option. Yeah. We need to install more bus stops, hire more drivers, and increase the size of Brisbane's fleet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah.
I call the youth member for Pennyfather.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to share with the House an insight surrounding youth justice in Queensland. When it comes to sentencing youth, it is generally accepted that the sentence provided should be restorative, providing young people with a chance to address their mistakes and move forward in a way that prioritises growth. Yet, youth detention remains prevalent in Queensland, exposing an already vulnerable demographic of young people to a system filled with trauma. Whilst youth detention is often the last port of call when sentencing youth, there is a small percentage of young people who slip through the cracks and who are subjected to verbal, physical and sexual abuse, neglect and isolation. That doesn't sound very restorative to me. Further, Indigenous Australians are disproportionately affected by youth detention. Throughout Australia's history as a nation, Indigenous Australians have been and continue to be mistreated by our very own government institutions. And though a lot of people in Australia like to pretend this is a thing of the past, it still happens to this day. And if we as a government don't make changes, it will become a thing of the future. It's time we break the cycle of recidivism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Boulogne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am here today to represent transgender youth across Queensland and speak on the need for reform, specifically a reform of the trans healthcare system, which is so important as many studies have shown how vital providing adequate healthcare is, especially to the lives of trans youth. Sadly, recent statistics show that transgender youth are 15 times more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. And currently, these necessary support systems are both inaccessible and ineffective. Right now, the waiting list for a gender consultation, the first step of many to transitioning, is roughly 2 years long. This lack of funding on part of the government is shameful, and it is clearly time for reform and focus on supporting trans youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Jardine.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I rise to draw your attention to the problem of youth crime in Queensland. Since 2019, youth crime has increased by 152% in the areas of Brisbane and southeasterly Queensland. In addition, 10% of these offenders are repeat offenders. The police department has acknowledged that such offenders do have other things in their life, such as social disadvantage, drug or alcohol use, and domestic and family violence. In spite of this, much more needs to be done to change the focus on youth crime and address the core problem. As the youth member for Jardine, I am of the opinion that the focus should instead be on helping offenders rather than on incarcerating them. Griffith criminology professor Molly McCarthy has stated that there is no evidence that the current approach to youth crime is fixing either the surface problem or the root problem. Government money must be invested into programs aiding at-risk youth, especially Indigenous youth, such as the existing Bring Our Mob Back program. Through early intervention and a focus on the cultural and social elements of the crime, Queensland will move beyond the age of youth crime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House on the issue that not only affects my area, but also South East and South West Queensland. This issue is the conditions of the Warrego Highway from Toowoomba, Queensland to Chinchilla, Queensland, which Queensland traffic states approximately 5,000 vehicles, including trucks, travel on per day. It is to be noted that this stretch of the Warrego Highway falls under the jurisdiction of the Darling Downs Regional Council, which have, quite frankly, failed to respond to significant decreases in the condition of the highway. In particular, the conditions of the highway between Dalby, Queensland and Chinchilla, Queensland have deteriorated to such an extent that after multiple serious and fatal accidents, the council was forced to reduce the speed from 100 kilometres an hour to 80 kilometres an hour in many areas indefinitely. It is vital that these repairs to the highway be undertaken with a level of urgency to avoid future interruptions and fatalities. I urge the House and councils to take serious consideration into this issue if you would like to maintain the support of Queenslanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Barcoo.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise before you among the lucky ones. I go home knowing that I have a place to express myself, connect with my family, and most importantly, I know that I am safe. These things may seem simple things to the ungrateful and unaware, I know, but they really are luxuries. Hannah Clark lay dying with her children, trapped inside a burning car. Dying with her children, her husband stalked the car, lunging himself at anyone who attempted to help the screaming little family. You might be sitting here, thinking that this tragedy is a world away from you, but you are wrong. This little family could be your neighbour or could be your co-worker, and you would never know, because this system does not recognise coercive control as a criminal offence. Not in Queensland, and furthermore, not anywhere in Australia. I implore our state to lead the way and not forget about Hannah Clark and her family. Don't bury her under the rubble of not my problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We call the youth member for Ithaca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to draw to attention of the House domestic violence. As COVID-19 has impinged on everyone's lives, the cases of domestic violence in Australia have increased. From 2020 onward, domestic violence has increased rapidly, with more than 50% of Australians reporting they have experienced or experiencing household violence. With the recent case of Hannah Clark, who tragically died along with her children after her abusive partner set her car on fire, there was many leading factors to why this horrible situation could not be resolved. However, the main aspect was police failing to recognise domestic violence. Australia's police force needs more training to ensure these callous numbers begin to fall. This needs to see police officers being trained fully in body language and knowing how to help victims leave abusive conditions. When I say body language, police need to be trained to see when victims of domestic violence have certain behaviours that could be alarming and the everyday person will not see. After further research was conducted, it was found that after police officers that participate in the training programs to assess and help domestic violence, they developed a better understanding of how to assess victims. By encouraging more training into the police force to assess and deal with domestic violence situations, we will be able to prevent further cases like Hannah Clark. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I wish to draw the House's attention to the slow implementation of renewable energy schemes in Queensland. While having the highest proportion of households with rooftop solar, Queensland has been falling behind neighbouring states in reaching net zero emission targets. Accounting for 25% of Australia's total energy consumption in previous years, Queensland's poor renewable energy plans ignore the urgency of the current climate crisis. With the country expected to reach average temperatures 0.5 degrees warmer than the rest of the globe in the near future, responsibility falls on our government to ensure a greater increase in renewable energy sources. With incentives to create jobs for the economy, improve electricity reliability, and decrease fossil fuel usage, sustainability-orientated actions demand greater place in Queensland legislation. Additionally, efforts should be made to introduce renewability schemes into public sectors such as schools, corporate companies, and community services to promote the importance of reducing greenhouse gases to wider society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Western.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to share with the House the age of criminal responsibility. Currently, the age of criminal responsibility is 10. This needs to be raised. In Queensland, the youth justice system deals with youth aged from 10 to 17 who have committed a crime. First, youth are sentenced in court by a magistrate or judge. They then may receive a period of imprisonment in youth detention. Detention centres have an effective system as education, routine and programs are set in place while being sentenced. Once youth are released, there are no counselling or rehabilitation programs offered. This system has proven to have negative impacts on teens, causing them to reoffend. Statistics suggest 38% of teens aged 10 to 17 return to sentence supervision within 6 months and 54% within 12 months. There are many reasons to support raising the age of criminal responsibility, such as some children have complex backgrounds with complex needs, which can be better addressed outside the justice system, or even simply that kids under the age of 12 lack the capacity to properly engage in this system. Locking kids up doesn't reduce their likelihood to offend. Instead, it steers them on a path to reoffend. Statistics should show that 94% of children who have been imprisoned between 10 to 12 will receive another prison sentence before they reach adulthood. Therefore, the age of criminal responsibility should be raised as it's currently only negatively impacting the youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Comet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to bring to the attention of the House the issue of domestic and family violence. Domestic violence is recognised as one person using violent or abusive behaviour to control another person in a relationship. This can include physical violence, property damage, sexual abuse, intimidation or harassment, financial abuse, or threatening to do any of my previous statements. From 2021 to 2022, 28,557 DVO applications were processed, with 72% being against an intimate personal partner and 27% being filed against one or multiple family members. Additionally, it was noted that 73% of applicants were female. Whilst DVO applications from this year did show a 0.8% decrease from the previous year, the insignificance of this change still poses dramatic concerns for the state of Queensland's family and domestic violence issues, suggesting a lack of successful operations implicated by the state of Queensland to reduce this high percentage. The government needs to place further consideration into the issue of domestic and family violence and legislate to more effectively prevent Queenslanders from being victimised and abused by the people closest to them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call the youth member for Thomson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member for Thompson, I wish to raise the legal issue of the age of criminal responsibility that has long plagued our state. No longer can we sit idle and watch the young people of Queensland at 10 years of age subjected to the harsh conditions in youth detention. It is cruel and inhumane that Queensland has been slow, dismissive and inactive to action law reform and lift the age to 14 years of age. We have been shamed and called out by the UN for our constant disregard for the welfare of children. We are signatory to the Convention of the Rights of Children, and we as Queensland are breaching their human rights. It is time that we as a state step up. It is time that we act in the best interest of children. And it is time that we bring Queensland into the future. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Flinders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw to the attention of the House on the prejudicial tone expressed to Australian media journalism that encourages on biased broadcasting reports at the expense of the integrity of Christian schools across Queensland. The underlying tone engraved within these publications not only damage the reputation of both the Christian community and schooling, but completely neglects Section 41 of the Anti-Discrimination Act 1991, alluding to the facade of Christianity being inhumane to society. With 84% of Australians tuning in on ABC News, bigotry reports on the basis of Christianity can cause harm to reputation, and therefore currently presents itself as a direct infringement to Section 10A, subsection 1 of the Defamation Act 2005. Conclusively, an amendment should be and must be made to legally bind news publications to Section 10A of this Act, to cease any further damage to Christianity's image, enabling it to be reinforced, furthermore preventing inequitable and harmful media publications in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Tingalpa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House about the current issue regarding the legality in being able to avoid the truth as a realtor when selling property in Queensland. Specifically, the ability to not disclose any information about whether or not a property has been affected by flooding or is in a flood-prone area. This is as stated by the Real Estate Institute of Queensland. An inquiry is recommended to be conducted since Queensland is currently described as the state with the most high-risk flood areas. Another factor that must be considered is that the global warming crisis and climate change are likely to increase the number of floods. This means that there will be more floods in the coming years, and it is vital that the flood-prone areas are protected. This will be done by alerting potential property owners of the possible risks and state of the property, so that they can make informed decisions as to whether they want to purchase the property and what best alternatives are. Therefore, the current legislation does not represent societal expectations and must be amended. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to address the House on an issue that is not only important to me and my family, but is crucial to the constituents of O'Connell. Over the past few decades, we have learnt extensively about mental health and its grasp on millions of Australians, particularly our young people. There are mental health services throughout this country that are catered for our youth, but accessing them is an entirely different ballgame. I commend those involved in the passing of the 2016 Queensland Mental Health Act, but more work must be done. Crucially, the impact of mental health issues has become endemic within our schools, and it's clear to see that the role of a traditional school counsellor is not enough. An ABC report conducted last year uncovered an up to 18-month wait to see a mental health professional, and in the worst scenarios, some had to report to emergency departments, which are already struggling. Throughout the pandemic, the calls for a lifeline to the mental health sector have been amplified by the struggles of our youth. Given the position that we are in, it is our responsibility to provide this lifeline, and we owe it to our young people to enact change now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Laura.
Mr. Speaker, youth members, Australia is a country with a very bad habit. We have a habit of mistreating the custodians of this very land we live on. In 2019, 18% of Indigenous Australians were living in overcrowded households, and this number peaks to 25% for Indigenous Australians living in remote areas. Let these numbers paint a very real, a very true pictures of the living conditions in Laura. First Nation people total 66% of Laura's population, and they are subjected to overcrowding and deprived of adequate housings. Under the Cook Shire Council, Laura is labelled as a township. This label denies Laura of adequate, appropriate funds to alleviate housing shortages. Calling Laura a township is a great disservice to First Nations people and their deep-rooted history. We ask for Australia to correct their bad habit. We ask for Laura to be recognised fittingly as a discrete Indigenous community and given their rightful funds to their Indigenous housing. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Banksia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House of an issue with great importance that needs immediate attention in Queensland. In 2021, Greens MP Michael Berkman proposed a bill to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14 years. According to the Parliamentary Committee's findings, over 17 children aged 10 to 13 were in youth justice custody every night. I ask you the question as to why the age of criminal responsibility was even decided to be as young as 10. Mr. Speaker, do you think a grade 5 student has the mental capacity to be held in an environment one like juvenile detention? Studies have shown that there is a high rate of recidivism when exposing children as young as 10 to these conditions. Instead of damaging a child's welfare, early intervention and therapeutic attention are the correct and just ways to divert criminal behaviour and ensure a promising future. I support the Parliamentary Committee's recommendations not to pass the bill Greens MP Michael Berkman has proposed, yet this problem remains unresolved. I urge the House to adopt the committee's recommendations where the minimum age of criminal responsibility be raised from 10 to 12 years to align with the national agenda for a uniform approach amongst states and territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Tullabudgera.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to address the House regarding the unfortunate flood event in Brisbane and surrounds earlier this year. As we all know, extensive damage and disruption was caused by these floods, with some of those effects still being felt today. It shut down shopping centres such as the iconic Toombul and countless small businesses. It wrecked our roads, and according to Sarah Richardson from ABC News, almost 70% of our suburbs felt some impact to private property. With those statistics, I'm positive that many of you in this chamber have too felt those effects. As part of this government, I am proud to inform you of the steps we are taking to ensure that everyone is receiving the help they need. We are providing grants and loans of up to $250,000 to small business owners to support their recovery. We have been offering free finance counselling services and land rent relief. These are only a few of the many services assisting everyone to get back on their feet. We are on track to building a new and improved Brisbane. However, with bipartisan support and commitment, we can achieve these goals more efficiently to build a better Brisbane. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Daintree.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the inequities of Queensland's education system, which disproportionately affects First Nations youth. While Queensland's curriculum increasingly incorporates First Nations histories and cultures in terms of content, the assessment system fails to consider traditional cultural practices, producing poor education outcomes. Attendance rates for Indigenous students still remain lower than non-Indigenous students at 82% as opposed to 92% in 2019. The individuals that do complete secondary education are subject to an archaic system that fails to recognise their customs, producing them to not achieve their best results and receiving an inadequate education that falls short of their community's needs in terms of educators, health professionals, and leveraging businesses by leveraging land assets and cultural knowledge. Mr. Speaker, it is the responsibility of Queensland's education system to cater to the needs of all Australians and recognise a diverse range of attributes and skills. While some Indigenous perspectives are embedded within the curriculum, we have fundamentally failed to provide a range of assessments that truly benefits our First Nations people. Adapting traditional assessment techniques to accommodate various cultural sensitivities will increase educational completion rates and ultimately benefit Indigenous communities when that knowledge is shared. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Baloo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members of the House, say that one of your loved ones were injured out in a rural area. The lack of phone towers in these areas across Queensland leave poor signal or no signal at all. It's putting all people in these areas at danger as it's stopping emergency contacting when it's needed most. People's lives are at stake, and it may increase the chance of fatalities. But not only people, livestock. If they were to be injured or sick and passed away as a result of not receiving treatment fast enough, it may affect small local business trading. This then can continue to have a domino effect, which then impacts individuals' living standards, as this may be one of their solid flows of incomes. It's already difficult enough for small rural towns to get the essentials for a comfortable living, and with fuel and market prices on the rise, it'll send residents into a spiral. As a government, it is important that we support all Australians and put all our Queenslanders first, and not just us in the cities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Endeavour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To start our day in Parliament, like every other day, we began with the Lord's Prayer, a Christian prayer that has been recited in Parliament since 1901. But does this 121-year-old tradition reflect modern Australia appropriately? Over 100 different religions have been recorded throughout Australia. Less than half our population is Christian, so why do we begin our business with this prayer? Tradition? Respect? Are we respecting those who do not believe in the Christian God? Queensland is incredibly diverse and multicultural, yet this is not represented in our parliamentary proceedings. The Australian Capital Territory begins its parliamentary proceedings with a period of silent reflection, where members reflect on their own religion and faith. This is a change Queensland should follow. This change does not dishonour the traditions of 1901, but rather reflects our maturity and diversity as a country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Tully.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As highlighted by Youth Member of Pike, I draw to the attention of the House the recent COVID-19 surge and its implications for the education sector. They raised an important point for the electorate of Pike, but this is also a prominent issue in Tully. The recent waves of COVID-19 have and continues to result in teacher shortages, which puts students at risk of not achieving the level of education they deserve. Similarly, students are also falling prey to the contagious virus and are often too unwell to conduct their studies from home or at the same pace at which they would in their regular classrooms. Consequently, this has negatively affected students' mental well-being, affecting additional stress and concerns. Moreover, teachers are not receiving adequate sick leave as they still must persist to teach from their homes while unwell and quarantining. If they do not, the aforementioned issues arise and further complicate things. Therefore, it is necessary to reconsider COVID-19 prevention methods within schools to ensure just and equitable outcomes for these stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to raise an issue of particular interest to the people of the electorate of Saxby. My people have informed me they are delighted with the Albanese government's changes to the climate change policy, with promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by the year of 2030. These, however, are just promises. We need to take proper action. The electorate looks forward to the possibility of being an active partner with the federal and state governments in installing a range of renewable options to help meet the emissions reduction target. We believe there are many available locations for the installation of both wind and solar farms of substantial size that can be used to benefit the local region and Queensland more broadly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to inform the House of an issue that needs to be prioritised in Queensland. I call on the Parliament to address the lack of healthcare available to rural Queensland. Essential qualities of law require it to be both fair and accessible. Accessible healthcare is not readily and easily available to those living in regional Queensland, including the Elliott locality, where the nearest hospital is a private facility located 19 kilometres outside of the region with only Tier 2 capabilities. Whilst I understand the current staffing shortages, the House must consider the health of all Queenslanders, including those living outside of our major cities. Queensland Health shows there are only 26 hospitals available to the 84,000 people living in rural Queensland. Even then, these hospitals are limited in their capabilities and do not receive the funding and skills compared to that of major hospital. The House must also consider the substantially high mortality rates of rural Queenslanders, with studies by the AIHW suggesting that their increased exposure to danger and reduced access to basic health necessities such as antibiotics majorly impacts the health of these civilians. I propose the introduction of more healthcare sites and increased education to the ones within across rural regions to maximise the access remote Queenslanders have to safe, dependable healthcare that is not an unreasonably excessive distance from their homes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Bungle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to inform the House of the atrocities of hospital understaffing and ramping issues Australian, specifically Queensland, paramedics face daily. Correlated research from various news outlets across the state show that patients considered emergency are not permitted into hospital for an average of 54.2 minutes. As such, the turnover time for paramedics on the road versus waiting for hospital attention is extremely unbalanced. The community of both Bunjil and Queensland is suffering greatly from the lack of ease into medical attention. The purpose of ambulances is to provide speedy travel and immediate but not permanent medical attention while ensuring the safety of patients as they journey to the hospital. That purpose is completely foregone when paramedics and patients are forced to wait for hours on end to secure a spot in a hospital bed and receive attention. This issue requires much consideration, with possible solutions such as hospital funding, increased nursing placements, and further expansion to the current medical programs in place. As such, I support the current decisions to open new hospitals and provide funding for existing ones. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That brings the adjournment debate to a close, unless there are any members who have not had an opportunity to speak today who wish to speak. Are there any members who have not spoken who would like to have the floor? The question is that the House to now adjourn. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no? No. You don't want to do that. I think the ayes have it. Ordinarily, members, I would leave the chamber right now, but I'm just going to make a few closing remarks about today's proceedings. Firstly, can I congratulate all of you on your contributions. They were both articulate, well-researched, and I believe that the way that you've delivered them as well really has been of a really high standard. I do want to say that you've had the full experience today. Sometimes we do youth parliaments and we do I'd call it Youth Parliament Light, but because you're legal studies, because you're actually looking at the entire legislative process, you've had the opportunity to do everything, including divisions. However, I should note that normally the bells ring for 4 minutes, and if you think that drives you crazy, yes it does. Also, I just wanted to comment on the fact that because you have done pretty much the entire process and you've included consideration and detail, sometimes our bills, we have very limited time to see ahead of time how much is contained in a bill, and sometimes there's very little notice given in terms of the amendments that are being brought forward. But some bills will contain anywhere between 120 and 250 clauses. Not all of them are debated, some are moved en bloc, but you can get the idea about just how important that consideration and detail process is to ensuring that we actually get a very positive legislative outcome. At the end of the day, as I always say to people, we're not choosing what our favourite soft drink is here, we're actually making laws. And that's the reason we have the number of decision points that we do. So clearly you did the second reading debate today, you had the bill being read a third time, then you also had the long title of the bill. The reason we do that is to ensure that we don't make legislation by accident. It's a very deliberate part of our system to make sure that we have those points of decision making that are very, very clear, that we make those knowing that this is something that's going to impact on a range of people in our community. The bill that you did today, I don't like the word bureaucrat, I like public servant better, but it worked very, very well in terms of the acronym for big data. And I can tell you it's a very, very interesting space to be in. I only yesterday had a group of students in from the Brisbane Dialogues talking about work that they'd done around social media, in particular around TikTok. And it's a very, very in-depth discussion that we had, but we could have spoken for hours. And it's one of our challenges as legislators in this House about being contemporary and making sure that we can keep pace with the rate of change that is occurring. And so big data is as much a part of that conversation as anything else. I do want to say that, of course, after we pass the bills today, the next phase would be that we would take that bill to the Governor by way of Executive Council. So the members to my right, of course, are all government members, and some overflow to this side, but particularly the Cabinet. Every member of Cabinet is part of the Executive, but of course they're also members of Executive Council. So 2 members of the Executive Council will always meet with the Governor to present those bills to ensure that the Governor is aware of the contents before he or she signs off on those. And at the moment we have Dr Jeanette Young, Her Excellency, as our Governor. So it's very important that the ministers, no matter if it's their portfolio or not, actually have an understanding of that. The second thing I was going to say is that you would have noticed, of course, that amendments were moved by ministers who didn't have carriage of the bill. So we had a minister who presented the bill and who spoke twice on the bill, but you also had the Minister for Transport and Main Roads presenting an amendment. And that's really important because there's no such thing as a bill that is, I guess, as insular as that it is only focused on one particular area. Almost every bill has fragments of the bill and clauses which relate to various different parts of portfolio responsibility in Cabinet. And also, it's important to note that bills can sometimes be a bill for particular purposes, but they can also be what we'd call an omnibus bill. And that's often brought on by the Attorney-General, and that bill would be one that has elements of multiple different areas all thrown into the one piece of legislation to be debated. So your studies and legal studies are really important, and it's really great that you had today's opportunity, of course, but I hope that you've taken away from this an understanding of some of the process and why the deliberations in this place, whilst not all members are parliamentarians, some of them are politicians and they tend to be louder rather than more articulate, it is very important work that is done here. And so I hope you've had something to take away from today. Can I just say a few very quick thank yous, of course. I do want to thank our parliamentary staff who've organised today, our Youth Parliament and our education team of Rebecca Quinnell, Katina Webb, Maria Mead, Kate Phillipson, Piper Foley and Marjorie Elworthy. We don't applaud in this place. Could you give them a big hear here? I also want to say that there's a number of people in the gallery today, both other educators, parents, carers, and of course also members of Parliament who've taken time out to visit. So can I say thank you to you for taking the interest in the Legal Studies Youth Parliament, and can you also give the gallery a big hear here? Finally, I do want to say a particular mention to your teachers. And our education team knows this very well, but my parents were both teachers, and I believe it is one of the most important jobs that we have. Sometimes a bit undervalued, but very importantly, your teachers are people who really care about you and shaping you into the people you're going to become once you leave school. And so it's really important that you remember that they're always there to support you and to make sure that they're putting their best foot forward so that you can do the same. So please, given all the work that they've done, can you please give your teachers a big hear here? Students, that is it from me. Thank you for having me as your presiding officer for today's Parliament. I really have enjoyed the contributions that you've made. You should be enormously proud of the work you've done. And with that said, I now adjourn the House. Thank you.
Yeah.